The evening at the Gilded Sparrow was settling into its usual rhythm. The air was thick with the smell of roasted coffee and the sweet, sharp scent of beer. Soft yellow light from lamps hanging from the ceiling fell on the dark wood of the tables and the red leather of the booths. The place was comfortably full. At the bar, friends who had just finished their workday laughed loudly, telling stories and unwinding. In the corners, couples talked in low voices, and a few people sat alone, staring into their drinks or at the screens of their phones. It was a familiar scene for the manager, a man who moved through the room with a practiced eye. He noticed when a glass was nearly empty and when a table needed wiping. His name was David, and he took pride in the smooth running of his establishment. His world was one of numbers and inventory, of making sure everything looked good and everyone was happy enough to order one more drink. And in this world, there were also the regulars, the people who were as much a part of the bar as the furniture. In a quiet corner, far from the main crowd, was one such regular. Most people never even noticed him. He was an older man, his hair more gray than brown, and he always wore the same coat, a dark, heavy thing that was worn thin at the elbows and cuffs. He didn't talk to anyone. He would come in, sit at the same small table, and order a single cup of coffee. He would nurse that one cup for hours, his hands wrapped around the warm mug, his eyes looking at something far away that no one else could see. The staff knew him as Leo. He was quiet. He caused no trouble, and he always left a small tip, even though it was clear he didn't have much. He was just there, a part of the background. If you had asked any of the customers to describe who was in the bar, most would have forgotten to mention him. On this particular night, David was walking past Leo's table with a tray of empty glasses when something unusual happened. Leo looked up. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, met David's. This was rare. Leo usually kept to himself, his gaze fixed on the table or the wall. David slowed down. "Everything all right, Leo? Need a warm-up on that coffee?" he asked, his voice friendly, but busy. Leo shook his head slowly. He seemed to be gathering his courage, like a man about to step off a high ledge. He cleared his throat, a soft, rough sound. "Mr. David," he began, his voice low but clear. He paused, then spoke again. "I am hungry." David stopped completely now, setting the tray down on a nearby table. He felt a familiar pang of mild annoyance. He wasn't running a charity. But before he could form a polite refusal, Leo continued. "I can play," Leo said, his eyes drifting towards the small stage at the other end of the room. "For a bit of food. I can play for you." David followed his gaze. On the stage sat the bar's grand piano. It was a beautiful old instrument with a deep, glossy black finish, but it was mostly for show. Sometimes on weekends, a local jazz trio would play, but during the week, it sat silent, its lid closed, with a few cocktail menus and a small plant resting on top of it. It was a piece of decoration. David looked back at Leo, then back at the piano. A small, disbelieving smile touched his lips. "Leo, play the piano." The idea was so strange it was almost funny. This quiet, worn-out man who looked like he carried the weight of 1,000 hard days, offering to play a grand piano. It was like a mouse offering to roar. A couple at the nearest table had overheard the conversation. The woman whispered something to her partner, and they both smiled, looking at Leo with a mixture of pity and amusement. The sound of their quiet laughter reached David's ears. In that moment, David's practical mind saw an opportunity. Business was a little slow. The crowd was quiet, maybe a little. Entertainment would liven things up, even if it was just a funny story for tomorrow. He imagined telling his staff, "You'll never guess what old Leo tried to do last night." He put on his best manager's smile, the one he used for difficult customers. "You, Leo," he said, his voice a little louder now, so others could hear. "You can play that thing." Leo simply nodded, his expression not changing. "All right, then," David said, chuckling. He waved a hand toward the stage. "A deal's a deal. You go on up there. You play something. Well, you play something that doesn't make my customers run for the door. And I'll have the chef make you our special shepherd's pie. On the house?" He winked at the laughing couple, sharing the joke with them. This was going to be a good story. He watched as Leo slowly, carefully, pushed his chair back and stood up. The old man walked toward the stage, his worn coat seeming to hang off his thin frame. The spotlight wasn't on, and the stage was dim, but every eye in the bar was now on him, watching the quiet man from the corner as he prepared to do something nobody believed he could do. A wave of quiet curiosity spread through the bar. The low hum of conversations dipped as people noticed the man in the warm coat, walking towards the stage. He moved slowly, not with shuffling uncertainty, but with a kind of tired purpose, as if he had a job to do and was going to see it through. All eyes were on him now. The friends at the bar stopped their loud storytelling and turned their stools to watch. The couples in the booths paused their intimate talks. It was not every day you saw something like this. The manager stood with his arms crossed, a faint, amused smile still playing on his lips. He leaned back against a table, ready to enjoy the show. He glanced around the room, pleased to see that his little stunt was already having an effect. People were paying attention. A few customers near the stage had their phones out, not exactly recording, but held ready, just in case something funny or interesting happened. The old man reached the steps to the low stage. He placed a hand on the railing and climbed up, one slow step at a time. He stood for a moment before the grand piano, looking like a stranger meeting a long-lost friend. It was a magnificent instrument, all sleek, dark wood and elegant curves, and it made his shabby coat look even more out of place. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't smile or give a little bow. His entire world seemed to shrink to the space between him and the piano. He reached out a hand and, with a surprising gentleness, lifted the lid that covered the keys. He placed it carefully on the floor beside the piano bench. His movements were respectful, almost ritualistic. Then he sat down. The old, worn leather of the bench creaked softly under his weight. He just sat there for a few seconds, his back to the room, his head slightly bowed. The audience waited. A few people exchanged glances. What was he doing? Was he changing his mind? Was he just going to sit there? The manager's smile widened a little. He thought to himself, he's forgotten how to even start. The poor guy. He almost felt a little bad for setting him up for this. He considered calling out, telling him it was okay. He could still have the food if he just came down. But before he could speak, the old man moved. He lifted his hands. They were old hands, the skin looking thin and marked with a few faint age spots. But his fingers were long and slender. He held them poised just above the ivory keys, his wrist relaxed. He took a deep, slow breath that was visible in the slight rise and fall of his shoulders. And then, he began to play. The first sound was a single, clear note, then another, then a few more, stumbling together into a very simple, childlike tune. It was the kind of thing a child might play in their first piano lesson. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. The notes were hesitant, a little clumsy. A ripple of laughter went through the bar. It wasn't mean or cruel, but it was their release of tension. This was what they had expected. This was the funny part. The manager chuckled and shook his head, looking down at his shoes. He had been right. It was a silly performance. He started thinking about how he would phrase the story later. And then he played a nursery rhyme. The man at the piano played the simple little melody once through. The sound was small and thin in the large room. A few people had already lost interest and turned back to their drinks. Their moment of amusement over. They had seen the joke, and now it was done. But the old man did not stop. He did not get up. He played the last note of the simple tune and let it hang in the air. And then, he paused. His hands rested on the keys. The room was quiet again, waiting for him to finish. But he wasn't finishing. He was preparing. He closed his eyes. His whole body seemed to still, to gather itself. The few people who were still watching felt a sudden, strange shift in the air. The feeling of a joke was gone. This was something else. His shoulders straightened. He lifted his head. And when his hands came down on the keyboard again, the world inside the Gilded Sparrow changed completely. It was no longer a clumsy, single-finger melody. It was a powerful, complex wave of sound. His left hand crashed down in a deep, resonant chord that vibrated through the floor, while his right hand flew into a cascade of notes that were impossibly fast and heartbreakingly beautiful. The simple child's song had been a mask, a quiet introduction. Now, the true music was unleashed. It was a storm. It was a story of sadness and hope, of memory and loss, all pouring out of the piano. His fingers, which had seemed so old and frail, now moved with a strength and speed that were hard to believe. They danced, they leaped, they pressed down with gentle tenderness and then with furious power. The music swelled, filling every corner of the bar, pushing against the walls, silencing every other thought. The laughter in the room died instantly, cut off as if by a knife. The woman who had been holding her phone let her arm drop to her side, her mouth slightly open. The manager, who had been smiling just moments before, was now frozen, his arms still crossed, but his face was a blank slate of pure shock. He was not seeing a shabby old man anymore. He was seeing an artist, a master, a force of nature that had been hiding in plain sight in the corner of his bar. For who knows how long. No one moved. No one spoke. They just listened, trapped in the beautiful, terrible spell he was weaving with his hands. The genius had been sleeping in the corner, and they had all laughed at him. Now, he was wide awake, and he was playing for a bit of food. The music didn't just enter the room. It took it over. It was like a sudden tide washing in, and every person there was caught in its flow. The beautiful, complicated storm of notes coming from the piano wiped away all the other sounds. The clinking of glasses stopped. The low murmur of the air conditioner was gone. The only thing that existed was the story the old man was telling with his fingers. He was no longer sitting stiffly. His whole body moved with the music. He leaned into the powerful parts, his shoulders dipping with the effort during the soft, gentle passages. He swayed slightly, as if comforting the piano itself. His face, which usually had a distant, empty look, was now full of feeling. You could see the concentration in the lines on his forehead, and a deep, old sadness in the way his eyes remained closed. He was not just playing notes from a page in his memory. He was reliving something. He was pouring out an entire lifetime of experience into the keyboard. The manager was still standing in the same spot, his arms no longer crossed. They hung limply at his sides. The amused smile was a distant memory, replaced by a look of complete and total shock. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. Just a minute ago, he had been laughing. He had treated this man, this artist, as a joke. He had offered him a plate of food like you would throw a treat to a dog who does a trick. The thought made his stomach twist. He looked at the old man, truly looked at him, and for the first time he didn't see a beggar or a fixture. He saw a person, a deeply talented person, who had been invisible to him until this very moment. Over at the bar, one of the friends who had been laughing loudly earlier was staring, his beer forgotten. The cold glass was sweating in his hand, but he didn't feel it. He was a young man, maybe in his 20s, and he thought he knew what talent was. He'd seen famous people on screens and listened to perfect songs on his phone. But this was different. This was raw and real, happening just a few feet away. It wasn't perfect in a polished way. It was perfect because it was so full of emotion. He felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know why. The music was just that powerful. In a quiet booth, a woman who had been on a date felt a single tear escape and roll down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. She wasn't sad. Not exactly. The music was speaking to a part of her she kept hidden, a part that remembered lost chances and old dreams. She glanced at her date, but he was also staring, captivated. They had been making small talk before, but now they were sharing this profound, silent experience. It was more intimate than any conversation they'd had all night. A waiter who was carrying a heavy tray of dirty dishes had stopped in the middle of the floor. He stood perfectly still, not wanting to make a single sound that would interrupt the magic. He knew the old man by sight, of course. He was the one who always sat in the corner. The waiter had sometimes felt a little impatient, having to refill his one cup of coffee so many times. Now, looking at the man pouring his soul out on the stage, he felt a deep respect. He understood now that the coffee wasn't the point. The man had just needed a place to be. The music built and built, rising to a furious, passionate peak. The old man's fingers flew across the keys in a blur, striking complex chords that sounded like thunder and lightning. Then, just as suddenly, the storm broke. The music fell away into a series of soft, questioning notes. It was like a person catching their breath after a long cry. The melody became gentle, a quiet memory of the earlier storm. It was heartbreakingly beautiful. In that quiet moment, you could hear a small, choked sob from somewhere in the audience. Someone else let out a shaky sigh. No one was bored. No one was looking at their phone. They were all held captive, each person connecting the music to their own private joys and sorrows. The old man, without saying a single word, had spoken directly to every heart in the room. He was nearing the end. The music began to build again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a storm of anger, but a powerful, determined climb. It was a final statement, a last, magnificent effort. His body tensed, every muscle focused. The final notes were not just played, they were struck with a kind of glorious, final strength. They rang out through the silent bar, clear and bright and true, hanging in the air for a long, breathtaking moment. And then it was over. His hands lifted from the keys and came to rest, trembling slightly. On his knees, the last vibration from the piano strings faded away, leaving behind a silence that was deeper and heavier than any silence they had ever known. The spell was broken, but no one knew what to do. The ordinary world of the bar, with its smells of beer and its dim lights, felt strange and new. They had all been on a journey together, and they had just returned, forever changed. The old man sat on the bench, his head bowed, his body looking small and tired again. The immense energy he had summoned now completely spent. The silence that followed the last note was not empty. It was full. It was heavy with the weight of what everyone had just felt. For a few seconds, nobody moved. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, afraid that even the smallest sound would break the beautiful spell that had fallen over them. All eyes were fixed on the man at the piano. He sat perfectly still, his shoulders slumped forward, his head hanging low. He looked exhausted, as if he had just run a great distance carrying a heavy load. The powerful presence that had filled the stage was gone. In its place was the same quiet, tired man from the corner, but no one saw him as that man anymore. They saw the artist who had been hiding inside. Then a single sound broke the quiet. It was the sound of one person sitting at a table near the back, starting to clap. It wasn't a loud, excited clap. It was slow, deliberate, and full of respect. It was the kind of clap you give when words are not enough. That one clap was like a signal. It woke everyone else up. Suddenly, the entire bar erupted. The stillness shattered into a thunderstorm of applause. It was loud and powerful and real. People were not just clapping with their hands. They were clapping with their whole bodies. They rose to their feet. The friends at the bar stood up, their chairs scraping against the floor. The couples in the booth stood up. The waiter, who had been frozen, still holding his heavy tray, managed to set it down on an empty table and joined in, clapping so hard his hands hurt. The sound of the applause was overwhelming. It filled the space where the music had been, a different kind of music now, a music of pure human appreciation. There were whistles and shouts of bravo, coming from people who didn't even know what the word meant. They just knew it was what you were supposed to say when something was magnificent. The manager was still standing in the middle of the room. The shock on his face had melted away, replaced by a deep, churning mix of emotions. He felt that shame again, hotter than before. But he also felt awe, and he felt a strange sense of pride, as if his bar had been chosen for this miracle. He looked around at the faces of his customers. Their eyes were wide, some were wet with tears, and every single one of them was smiling with a kind of stunned joy. He had wanted to liven the place up, but he had never imagined anything like this. He started clapping too, slowly at first, then harder and harder, trying to put all of his apology and his thanks into the sound. Through all this, the old man on the stage seemed unaware of the storm of noise he had created. He slowly pushed the piano bench back. It made a soft scraping sound that nobody could hear over the applause. He stood up, his movement stiff and slow. He did not turn to face the cheering crowd. He did not bow. He did not smile. He simply reached out and, with the same gentle care as before, picked up the lid of the piano and placed it back over the keys, closing the chapter on the music. Then he turned and walked to the steps of the stage. As he came down, the crowd that had gathered near the front parted for him. It was not a crowd blocking his way. It was a pathway they were creating for him. They looked at him as he passed, their hands still clapping, their faces filled with a new kind of respect. They were seeing a man, not a mystery. A person, not a performer. He walked through the room, his eyes looking down at the floor, as if he was embarrassed by all the attention. Or maybe he was just very, very tired. He made his way back to his small table in the corner. The applause followed him, not stopping until he had sat down in his usual chair. Only then did the clapping slowly begin to fade, turning into a buzzing, excited chatter that filled the room again. People were talking all at once. Did you hear that? I've never heard anything like it in my life. Who is he? The manager watched him go back to his corner. He knew what he had to do. He turned and hurried towards the kitchen, his mind racing. He pushed through the swinging doors. The shepherd's pie, he said to the chef, his voice urgent. Make it now, and make it the best one you've ever made. Put extra everything in it, and add a piece of that chocolate cake. The big one. The chef, a large man with a sweaty face, looked up from his stove. What's the rush? Who's it for? The manager pointed a thumb towards the dining room. It's for him, the man who was just playing the piano. The chef wiped his hands on his apron. He had heard the music faintly from the kitchen, and the sudden roar of applause. He nodded, understanding. That was him? I'll get it right now. Back in the bar, the atmosphere had completely changed. The air felt lighter, charged with a shared excitement. People were not just customers in the same room anymore. They were a group of people who had witnessed something special together. They kept glancing towards the corner, where the old man sat, once again looking like a quiet shadow. But he was no longer invisible. He was the most important person in the room. The manager came out of the kitchen, carrying a tray. On it was a large plate heaped high with shepherd's pie, steam rising from the mashed potatoes on top. Next to it was a generous side of vegetables and a huge slice of rich, dark chocolate cake. He also carried a tall glass of cold milk. He walked across the room. This time, he did not walk with the swagger of a manager. He walked with the quiet respect of someone approaching a king. He stopped at the old man's table. Leo, he said, his voice soft. He set the tray down carefully on the table. The food looked and smelled wonderful. This is for you. Thank you. Thank you for what you just did. The old man looked up from the table. His pale blue eyes met the manager's. For a second, there was no expression in them. Then he gave a small, slow nod. It wasn't a nod of thanks for the food. It was a nod of acknowledgement, as if to say, "You're welcome." Then he looked down at the plate of food. He picked up the fork, his hand still trembling slightly from the effort of playing. He broke the crispy top of the shepherd's pie and took a small bite. He chewed slowly, his eyes closed again, as if tasting real food for the first time in a very long time. The manager stood there for a moment, watching him, before turning and walking away, leaving the man in peace. The performance was over, but the memory of it would live in that bar for a very, very long time. The rest of the evening in the bar had a different feeling. It was like the air itself had been washed clean. The usual noise of people talking and laughing was still there, but it was softer now, more thoughtful. People spoke in lower tones, and their eyes would often drift towards the corner, where the old man was slowly eating his food. He ate with the same quiet focus he had used to play the piano. There was no rush. He savored each bite of the warm shepherd's pie, each tender piece of meat and vegetable. He drank the cold milk. He did not look up or acknowledge the stares. He was in his own world again, but this time, everyone knew what a vast and beautiful world it was. The manager did not go back to his usual duties. He found himself lingering near the bar, watching the old man. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He felt ashamed of his earlier behavior, but more than that, he was filled with a burning curiosity. Who was this man? Where did he come from? How did someone with such an incredible gift end up here, in this bar, trading a masterpiece for a plate of food? He thought about the old man's life. Did he have a family? Was he alone? Had he once played in grand concert halls for thousands of people? The manager's practical, business-minded world had no room for mysteries like this. But now, this mystery was sitting in his bar, and he knew he had to understand it. After a long while, the old man finished his meal. He had eaten every last crumb of the shepherd's pie and every bit of the chocolate cake. He carefully placed his fork and knife together on the empty plate. He wiped his mouth with a napkin and took a final sip of water. Then he slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He began to walk towards the door. This was his usual time to leave. The manager saw him moving and his heart jumped. He couldn't just let him walk out. Not like this. Not without saying something more. He quickly moved from behind the bar and intercepted the old man near the entrance. "Leo," he said, his voice a little too loud, filled with the nervous energy. "Please wait. Can we talk for a moment?" The old man stopped and turned. His face was calm, but tired. He looked at the manager, waiting. What you played?" The manager stumbled over his words. "It was the most amazing thing I have ever heard. I had no idea. I am so sorry for before." The old man gave a small, slow shake of his head. It was a gesture that seemed to say, "There is no need for sorry." It was a forgiveness that was so simple and complete. It made the manager feel even more humble. "Please," the manager said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He gestured to a quiet table away from the others. "Please, sit with me for just 5 minutes." The old man looked at the table, then back at the manager. For a long moment, he seemed to be considering it. Then he gave a single, slight nod and walked to the table, sitting down. The manager sat opposite him, leaning forward. "I don't mean to be rude," he began, "but who are you? How can you play like that?" The old man was silent for so long that the manager thought he wasn't going to answer. He just looked at his own hands, resting on the table. They were the hands that had created the magic. Finally, he spoke, his voice a soft rustle. "A long time ago," he said, "music was my life. It was all I had." He paused, gathering the memories. "I played in many places, but life has a way of changing. Things happen. You lose things, people, the music. It stayed inside. It is a part of me. But the world outside, it moved on." He didn't give details. He didn't talk about a great tragedy or a famous past. He spoke in simple, general terms, but the pain behind them was clear and real. He spoke of a life that had taken a wrong turn, of a light that had slowly been dimmed by hardship and time. "I come here," the old man continued, looking around the bar, "because it is quiet. It is a place to be. The music, it stays inside. But tonight, the hunger was loud, and the piano was there. It called to the music inside. So I answered." The manager listened, his own problems feeling small and silly. He thought of his worries about inventory and profits. This man was talking about a lifetime of carrying a beautiful, heavy gift inside him. A gift that the world had forgotten. "Leo," the manager said, his voice firm with a new decision. "I want you to come back. Not just to sit in the corner. I want you to play. Properly. I will pay you. Not with food. With real money. You can play whenever you want. For as long as you want. This can be your place. He held his breath, waiting for the answer. It seemed like the perfect solution. The old man would have a home for his music, and the bar would have its own unique, incredible artist. The old man looked at him. A faint, gentle smile touched the corners of his mouth for the first time. It was a sad smile, but a kind one. Thank you, he said. That is a good offer. A kind offer. He took a slow breath. But the music, it does not belong to a schedule. It does not come from money. It comes when it needs to. It was hungry tonight. So it came. Maybe it will be hungry again. Maybe not. I cannot promise it. He pushed his chair back and stood up. The conversation was over. Thank you for the food, he said. It was very good. And with that, he turned and walked out the door, disappearing into the night. The manager sat at the table for a long time, staring at the empty chair. He felt a sense of loss, but also a strange sense of peace. He had tried to capture the magic, to put it in a box and schedule it. But the old man was right. You couldn't tame something that wild and beautiful. The old man did come back. A few days later, he was there again, sitting in his usual corner with his single cup of coffee. He was the same quiet man as before. But everything was different now. The staff treated him with a new reverence. The customers who recognized him would give him a respectful nod. The piano on the stage sat with its lid closed. But now it was a symbol of a secret that they all shared. They knew what wonder it held. He never played for food again. The manager made sure he never had to, always making sure a hot meal found its way to his table, whether he asked for it or not. And sometimes, just sometimes, on a quiet evening when the mood was right, the old man would look at the piano for a long time. Then he would stand up, walk to the stage, and lift the lid. And the beautiful, terrible, wonderful storm would fill the room once more. It was a gift, not a performance. A reminder that the most extraordinary things can be hiding in the most ordinary corners, waiting for the right moment to be seen.